Greetings. This is a lecture on Aristotle's Metaphysics and Epistemology, and I envision it being in two halves, where I'll go through half of the lecture and then I'll stop and record the second half subsequently. So let me begin by sharing my screen. And we're looking at Aristotle's Metaphysics and Epistemology, and of course, we're looking at this on the heels of having looked at Plato, Aristotle's teacher, and Plato's Metaphysics and Epistemology. So Aristotle gets many of his ideas from Plato and kind of gives his own riff on them. He disagrees with Plato in very important ways, but he agrees with Plato in certain other ways, and we'll be looking at them. So, why isn't this working? There we are. So Aristotle, as I mentioned, was Plato's teacher. Aristotle was Plato's student. He is credited, Aristotle is, with being a practical man of earth, and this is largely due to his metaphysics and to his epistemology, and we'll see that shortly. He was also a biologist and a physicist, and while by contemporary standards his physics wasn't very good, even by contemporary standards his biology was actually quite good for his day and time. Apparently he did meticulous drawings, botanical drawings, etc., of various biological specimens, and really wasn't until the invention of the modern microscope, that his observations were surpassed. So he was a very keen observer, and he championed observation as a way of doing philosophy and a way of doing science. And notice this stands in contrast to Plato. Recall that Plato was suspicious of sensory information and didn't really think that we got a lot of knowledge through our senses. By contrast, Aristotle represents the empiricist school of thought, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. He happened to have been a tutor to Alexander the Great. And in fact, Alexander the Great used to send Aristotle biological specimens from around the empire at Aristotle's request. But he wasn't a tutor for very long, I don't believe, but he was a tutor. Aristotle's father had been the court physician for the royal Macedonian house, for Philip of Macedonia, Alexander's father. And so in other words, Aristotle's family had been friends and in a sense allies of the royal house of Macedonia. But the Athenian Greeks didn't really consider the Macedonians Greek, and they kind of took offense at the Alexander's rule of Athens and the pro-Athens government that was installed in Athens, the pro-Alexandrian government that was installed in Athens during the reign of Alexander. So this got Aristotle into some political trouble after Alexander died. Aristotle he was regarded as a Macedonian sympathizer and one not truly loyal to Athens, and he became very unpopular. In 323 BCE, when Alexander the Great died, Athens was no longer safe for Aristotle, who was seen, as I said, as a Macedonian sympathizer. Aristotle was on the verge of being charged with impiety. And Aristotle go, wait a minute, I've seen that movie. You hopefully recall that Socrates had been charged with impiety by the Athenian Senate and ultimately was executed, sentenced to death and executed. And so Aristotle thought, I'm getting out of here. So Aristotle declared, I will not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy. And he fled back to his hometown. All of this political intrigue may have been too much for him because he actually died less than a year later. So this is a painting you may be familiar with. Maybe you've seen it already. I believe it's a Raphael painting, and it's entitled School of Athens, I believe. And apparently many of the individuals in this painting are supposed to represent important ancient figures of either mathematicians or scientists, philosophers, or whatnot. But center in the painting are the two figures, and these are to represent Plato and Aristotle. Plato on the left-hand side, Aristotle on the right-hand side. And note Plato, of course, he's sort of pointing upwards and, to indicate the sort of loftiness, the transcendence of his philosophy. He's talking about the realm of being, which is outside of space and time and beyond the realm of becoming, etc. Whereas Aristotle is gesturing down now towards the ground, there's my hand, and again suggesting that the Aristotelian philosophy is going to be a more worldly philosophy and concerned with observing this world, and it seems to be a challenge to the Platonic idea of dual realms, and basically embracing the idea that the world we see on a daily basis is the only world that exists. So this is the characteristic of Aristotelian thought. So I thought I'd mention that, but I also wanted to do this one, which I think is rather far way to go for a joke, but okay. So this brings into now focus a dispute in terms of epistemology that went on for centuries. This dispute between rationalism on the one side and empiricism on the other. So the rationalist philosophers, they all held the top three positions here. Number one, they held to the existence of innate ideas, ideas that we have that we're born with. We're born with a certain complement of ideas or knowledge, right? So Plato, of course, is perhaps the most robust in terms of the catalog of innate ideas that he thinks we are born with, right? The whole knowledge of all the forms we're born with, according to Plato. Not all the rationalists. In fact, very few of the other rationalists were quite that robust, but they all did have the idea that there were certain things that we could know innately, right? That we're born with this knowledge. Perhaps something like for two things to be identical, they must share all the same properties. Well, that seems to be a true claim, a necessarily true claim, and it's not a claim that I learn on the basis of experience. It seems to be a claim I bring to my experience. Or the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. We're very confident that that's true, and yet we haven't measured every shortest distance between every 2 points, and yet we're nevertheless quite certain that it's true. So it doesn't seem to be based on experience, it seems to be based on something else, and the rationalists would say, yes, exactly, it's innate, right? Number two, rationalists believe that the senses tend to be a poor, unreliable source of knowledge. Of course, Plato is evident of this, right? He doesn't think we gain genuine knowledge through our senses. And then finally, the rationalists seem to hold that these innate ideas, these a priori ideas that are independent of experience, are the ideas that we can be most certain of, that this is the most reliable knowledge there is. I think the rationalists are probably on their strongest grounds when they point to things like math and geometry and logical truths, because we do seem to know these, they don't seem to depend on experience, and we seem to be very, very confident of the conclusions of these a priori sciences. So were I to say 2 + 2 = 4, notice I say 2 + 2 = 4, and I'm absolutely certain that that's the case. It's not like 2 + 2 probably = 4. No, we're absolutely certain that it equals 4. So the deliverances of math and geometry and certain a priori sciences, maybe logical analysis, etc., seem to be quite confident, quite certain, and not dependent on experience. However, in contradistinction to the rationalism, we have the opposite view, which is the empiricists. And they take issue with all three of these claims. First of all, empiricists deny that there's any such thing as innate ideas. Aristotle coins the phrase, nothing is in the mind that wasn't first in the senses, right? And this is the slogan that is associated with all empiricists, right? They deny that there are any innate ideas. All ideas come to us mediated by sensory knowledge. Second, they think the senses are a reliable way of coming to know objective truth, and that we should and must and do trust our senses as a source of knowledge. So again, this is taking issue with rationalism. And finally, they think, look, a priori knowledge is fine as far as it goes, but there's the vast majority of things that we know and that we need to know cannot be gained through a priori investigation or introspection. We have to actually observe the world. You're never going to know what color my eyes are if you don't look. You're never going to know what the capital of France is if you don't do research, empirical research. And you can do all the a priori reflection and speculation and introspection in the world. That's not going to give you answers to these questions. So you need to use your senses in order to gain these very important, useful kinds of knowledge. So that's the dispute between the rationalists and the empiricists. And then I have on the bottom row representations of philosophers through the centuries who've been on one side or the other. I think of Parmenides as kind of a proto-rationalist. I mean by that he kind of pre-exists this dispute, but we can see in Parmenides a kind of proto-rationalism because he's arguing against the possibility of change on completely rational, a priori logical grounds, even though this seems to be contradicted by the senses. And he would say, well, then your senses are deceiving. So again, you have this prioritizing over a priori rational logical speculation and a denigration of information that comes to us through the senses. On the other hand, you have Heraclitus, who trusts his senses. And he says, no, change is real. And how do I know this? I can see it, right? So I think of Heraclitus as a proto-empiricist, valuing the testimony of the senses, even when it sometimes seems to contradict rational argument. But when it comes to full-blooded rationalists, you have someone like Plato, clearly a rationalist. He believes all three of the things we discussed. After Plato, you have philosophers like St. Augustine, St. Anselm, René Descartes, who is the next philosopher we're going to be looking at in this course, Baruch Spinoza, and Gottfried Leibniz, who Spinoza and Leibniz were near contemporaries of Descartes. Depending on how I configure this course, sometimes we look at their ideas as well. In this particular version of intro, I'm not going to be spending time with Spinoza and Leibniz, but they were definitely rationalists. On the other side, we have Plato's student Aristotle. And again, he disagrees with Plato on all three of these points, and he is indeed an empiricist. But historically, we also have St. Thomas Aquinas, who is also an empiricist. And then as a contemporary of Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, we have three, they happen to be British philosophers, John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume. And we actually are going to be looking in some detail at Locke, Berkeley, and Hume in this course going forward. Right? So just so you know some of the players and what teams they play for. So key points to understanding Aristotle's metaphysics and epistemology. Before talking about how he disagrees with Plato, let's outline a few of the things that he actually agrees with his teacher Plato about. First, he would agree that knowledge, to be worthy of the title knowledge, must be of timeless and universal truths and concern with what things have in common. So he wants to say that genuine knowledge can't be fleeting. It's true today, it's not true tomorrow. No, it has to be timeless and eternal truths. That's what real knowledge consists in. But fortunately, he thought some realities were not subject to change. And so knowledge of those realities would be timeless and eternal knowledge. Since the objects don't change, the knowledge wouldn't change. Right? Now, what is it that he thinks are timeless and eternal realities? Well, forms, in the same way that Plato thought of forms as timeless and eternal realities. He's in agreement with Plato on that. Now, the nature of forms he disagrees with, set that aside for the moment, but do there exist such things as forms? Aristotle would say yes, right? He also refers to them as essences or natures, which is fine as well, but he has in mind pretty much the same thing that Plato had in mind with forms. God, Aristotle thought, was a timeless and eternal reality, a transcendent thing, right? An unchanging thing. And so knowledge of God would equally be unchanging knowledge. He also thought that the heavenly objects were unchanging objects. The stars and the moon and the sun and whatnot. That anything extraterrestrial over and above the earth was a timeless and eternal reality. He was operating within the framework of four elements, earth, fire, water, and air, as many of the ancient Greeks were. But he thought that the celestial world was so different than the terrestrial world that it must actually be made out of something different. And he proposed a fifth element, the quintessence, and that only that such a radically different element could explain why the celestial world was a world of timeless and eternal elements, right? Or objects, rather. They were perfect spheres that moved in perfect circles. Well, nothing on this plane, nothing on the earth is a perfect sphere, and nothing in this earth moves in perfect circles. And so they are timeless, they're eternal, they're unchanging, they're perfect spheres, they move in perfect circles, therefore they must be something else. Again, quintessence. Now, we don't think he's right about that, right? We think he was mistaken. And that'll be very important when we look at the revolution in thought that happens with the advent of Galileo and the advent of René Descartes. But that's a preview of coming attractions. In any event, for his time, he thought of these things, heavenly objects again, as not subject to change. He also thought biological species were not subject to change. And again, we don't think he's right about that. He was living prior to evolution. Now, both he and Plato had considered evolution, and both he and Plato rejected evolution as not a tenable hypothesis. So the idea of evolution has been around for centuries, right? Millennia, actually. What Darwin offers is not this unique idea of evolution, but what he offers is a reasonable mechanism of evolution. We go, and here's how evolution would go on. Here's how it could take place. And so that was lacking in to prior individuals who had considered evolution, right? Anyway, because he thought some realities were not subject to change, Aristotle believed that fixed or eternal knowledge was indeed possible. And that's what should concern the philosopher-scientist. And remember, I'll say this repeatedly, for people like Plato and Aristotle and the ancients and even the medievals, there wasn't a sharp distinction between philosophy and science. But each of them are trying to learn about these timeless and eternal realities. Again, both he and Plato rejected the notion of evolution. And also, like Plato, Aristotle agreed that there was sort of a hierarchy to reality, that objects had degrees of existence. Some things were more real than other things. Not all things had the same degree of reality. But it's important to note that while he agrees with Plato, there are differing degrees of reality, of ontological dependence and independence, etc. He reverses the order. So for Plato, the more abstract realities, forms, are more real than the particular instantiations. That's Plato. Aristotle turns that on its head. And he says, no, the particular things are more real than their abstractions. And so particular human beings are more real than the species Homo sapien. Again, we'll look at this again in a moment, but for Aristotle, there couldn't be a species Homo sapien if there weren't actual particular human beings. He did feel that forms were real, objective, and eternal. However, Aristotle argues that they cannot exist separately from their particular substances whose forms they are. So that is in contrast to Plato. While he agrees with Plato that forms are real and that they're eternal and that they're objective, what he denies is that they can exist off on their own in some Plato's heaven, right, the realm of being. No, he thinks that they must exist in the particulars themselves. So he disagrees with Plato on the following. First, he's not trying to argue for some sort of relationship that exists between forms and particulars. Why is that? Because the forms exist as instantiated in the particulars. The form exists as part of the particular object. So there's not a relationship between the two. The form is the form of the object, right? And so for Plato, forms exist off in the realm, well, here I'm missing, you can't see my hand, but anyway, forms exist off in the realm of being, particulars exist down here in the world of becoming, and there's some sort of relationship going on between the two. So Plato's dualism requires making out what that relationship could be. But Aristotle is rejecting Plato's dualism. And so he doesn't have to account for what the relationship between the two are, since they don't exist separated from one another. They are actually united in the particular itself. By contrast, Plato had argued that forms exist independently of their particulars. So I'm just repeating myself here. Again, Aristotle held that the visible world, the world we encounter with our senses, that we reflect on with our minds, was reality. By contrast, Plato had argued that reality was divided into two realms, the invisible realm being more real than the world of sense. Aristotle's rejecting that, and he's embracing kind of a one world sort of worldview. And again, something I've mentioned a moment ago, Aristotle believed that more concrete individual things, such as particular human beings, are more real than abstract items such as species Homo sapien, since there could not be the form of human if there were not actual humans for it to belong to, unlike Plato, who believed that the more abstract things were real. Right? So if you recall, I said that if we had somehow gotten rid of all the cats, Plato would say that the form of cat would be unaffected by this, and the form of cat would be fine. Just as if we erase all of the triangles, that wouldn't change triangularity at all. Right? But Aristotle argues in contrast to that. If there were no actual cats, there could not be cat form. If there were no actual triangles, there could not be triangularity. So that's a very big distinction between Plato and Aristotle. Philosophy and the dialectical project were worthwhile, so in that sense he's agreeing with Plato, and it is the goal of theoretical reason, yes. However, for Aristotle, observation must play a role. So observation is crucial to the progress of science and philosophy, according to Aristotle. And so whereas Plato had dismissed observation as unreliable and unnecessary, Aristotle's championing observation. Again, there is no clear distinction between philosophy and science. The successful conclusion of a philosophical, or for that matter, a scientific inquiry, which must include observation as well as argument, will yield the correct definition of the concept under discussion, the essence or the species being considered. So for instance, we might ask, what is it that all and only courageous acts have in common by virtue of which they are courageous acts, and be seeking to come to an understanding of what the essence of courage is, what the form of courage is. But similarly, we might ask, what is it that all and only cats have in common by virtue of which they are cats? And again, what we're looking for is the essence of cat, or form of cat, or we might say cat nature. Again, what is a veterinarian student going to be looking at? The veterinarian student is trying to understand cat nature so that he knows something about all cats, not just this particular cat. Now, for Aristotle, he has to study particular cats in order to understand cat nature. But what his goal is to understand cat nature in general, written large. Oops, went the wrong way. These discovered essences are critical for scientific demonstrations. We'll talk more about that a bit later. Okay, so now that damn change thing. So keep in mind that what got this whole philosophical project going was Thales worrying about change and what is the nature of change, if you think back that far. But then more recently, you had Plato dealing with the controversy about change that we got coming from Parmenides and Heraclitus. Parmenides saying that change is impossible and change is an illusion, and Heraclitus saying change is real and it's really the only constant of reality. So recall the problem posed by Parmenides. Either change is being coming from being, or change is being coming from non-being. But wait a minute, if it's the first, being is coming from being, then there is no change, because what is being already was being. right? So it's just being, still being, right? And if being is still being, then you don't have change. Right? But the latter is impossible. Being coming from non-being, because nothing comes from nothing. And so non-being cannot account for being, for existence now. Right? So if what is what was, no change. If what is came from nothing, that's a non-starter. Nothing comes from nothing. Therefore, Parmenides concludes that change is impossible and is some sort of trick of the senses and is an illusion. Thus, change is impossible, Parmenides concludes. Now, the problem of change persisted despite Plato's best efforts to resolve the dilemma. Now, Plato's attempt to resolve the dilemma was to say, well, Parmenides, you're right, there is no change if what you're talking about is the realm of being, but you're wrong if what you're talking about is the realm of becoming. And to Heraclitus, he says, Heraclitus, you're right if what you're doing is talking about the realm of becoming, because the realm of becoming is a realm of constant change. But you're wrong, Heraclitus, if you're talking about the realm of being, because there is no change in the realm of being. So he tries to advance the issue by kind of granting a partial win to both and a partial loss to both. But Plato does not really so much resolve the dilemma as he does entrench the dilemma, because now you have these two radically different levels of reality, realm of being, realm of becoming, and how could they possibly be related to one another and interact or account for one another? And it just becomes, I think, that much more troublesome. Aristotle's resolution requires that we're much more careful about what it means to say that a thing is. So Aristotle attempts his own resolution to this debate. And he says, I think it's because we're too sloppy in our language when we use the word is. So think of a former president who one time answers a question by saying, well, it all depends on what your definition of is. Aristotle thinks that we need to distinguish between two very different ways that a thing can be said to be. For instance, am I a French speaker? That is, do I, Kenton Harris, have the ability to speak French? Well, there's a sense in which the correct answer to that question is no. No, Kenton Harris does not have the ability to speak French. And yet there's another sense in which the correct answer to that question is yes, Kenton Harris does have the ability to speak French. That is, I am, Kenton Harris, a French speaker, and I am, Kenton Harris, not a French speaker. Well, Aristotle would say that I am, Kenton Harris, a French speaker in potentiality, but I am not a French speaker in actuality. So this is the distinction that he wants to draw, and it's crucial to understanding his resolution to this change debate. Notice, I do not speak French at the moment. I do not possess the ability to speak French, again, at the moment. Nevertheless, I do possess the ability to speak French in the sense that I am the sort of thing that can speak French. So there's a sense in which I am a French speaker. I'm a French speaker in potentiality, though not in actuality. I possess the potential to speak French. Why? Because I'm a human being. And human nature permits human beings to learn other human languages. So I am the sort of thing that can learn French. And in that sense, I possess the potentiality to speak French, though I'm not actually speaking French at the moment. That is, I be, the sort of thing, human, whose nature permits him to learn and to speak French. So notice what he's drawing on. He's drawing on the idea that I have an essence, I have a form, I exhibit human nature. And part of human nature is the latent capacity to learn other human languages. So as a human being, because you know I'm a human being and you know what human nature is, then you know I have the ability to speak French in potentiality. Now, do I have the ability to speak French in actuality? Sadly, not at the moment. It's been on my list of things to do for like the last 40 years, but so far, no. By contrast, think of it this way: an apple tree possesses the ability to speak French neither in potentiality nor in actuality. Notice, an apple tree is not the sort of thing that could speak French. So it doesn't have any latent potentiality for French speaking. Right? How do you know this? Because you know, on some level, apple tree nature. And you know that apple trees possess the ability to do certain things, right? They possess the ability to produce apples, or they possess the ability to have blossoms of a particular kind or scent. They possess the ability to have leaves of a particular shape. So they have certain latent potentialities, but French speaking is not among them. Right? You know that because you know apple tree nature. So knowing the nature of a thing for Aristotle is equivalent to knowing its latent potentialities, certain things it can do and certain things it can't do. Right? Notice, not even fluent French speakers possess the ability to speak French. Try that again. Even those fluent in French, so fluent French speakers, possess the ability to speak French in potentiality only when they are sitting quietly doing a watercolor painting or knitting. In other words, when not actually speaking French. So even French speakers aren't actual French speakers if they're not actually speaking French. Now they can move to actuality, right? They can move from potentially speaking French to actually speaking French much more easily than I could, right? But it still would require a movement from potentially speaking French to actually speaking French. So Parmenides' puzzle was founded on a false dichotomy, according to Aristotle. Remember, a dichotomy is to say you have a choice of two, A or B. A false dichotomy is to say you have a choice of two, A or B, and that's not really true. There's more than two options. That's what's meant by a false dichotomy. So what Aristotle is claiming is Parmenides presented us with a false dichotomy. It is not the case that change is either being coming from being or being coming from nothing. A change is a pre-existing potentiality moving towards actuality. So it's not nothing, it's a pre-existing potentiality. And then it moves somehow to actuality. So if I had a pot of water that was cold water, it's potentially hot. Right? What? It doesn't possess heat in actuality, but it possesses the potential to be hot. And I can heat it up. Right? Now, it's going to take an external impetus to move it from potentially hot to actually hot, right? I'm going to have to put it on a burner and turn it on, or some other way of heating it, right? So something from outside the pot of water is necessary to move it from potentially hot to actually hot. But I know, because I understand pots of water, that it could be heated up, right? As opposed to, I don't know, my idea of France can't be heated up. Right? It doesn't possess the ability to be heated. That's not its nature, right? So again, knowing a thing and knowing its nature means is a shorthand way of knowing ways in which it could be changed and knowing ways in which it could not be changed. You could change me into a French speaker. You couldn't change an apple tree into a French speaker, right? There's an old joke, which is, don't try to teach a fish to swim because it wastes your time and it annoys the fish. So it changes a pre-existing potentiality moving towards actuality. Potentiality is not actuality, but it's not nothing either. Right? Again, it does be in some sense. It has some degree of existence, potential. Any change in a substance is the actualization of a pre-existing potentiality. what actual and potential characteristics a thing has are determined by the thing's nature or form or essence. And I'm using these words interchangeably. A thing's form is shorthand for all the ways that it is in potentiality or could be. Further, the only thing that could move a thing from potential to actual is a mover, an impetus, outside the moved thing. So if that thing is moved, it has to be moved by something external to it. So consider a blue rubber ball, right? So this blue rubber ball is actually blue, it's actually spherical, it's actually bouncy. The object is not square, the object is not red, the object is not doggy, right? It's not canine. The ball's squareness, redness, or dogginess, etc., don't exist. But there are different kinds of non-existing. Notice the ball is potentially red if you painted it. It's bouncy, but it's potentially soft and gooey if I melted it. The ball is not right now an actual globe, but it's potentially a miniature globe if I were to draw little continents on it or something like that. So there are things that could be done to that ball that would change its current actual properties to something else, red or soft and gooey. But notice the ball isn't even potentially doggy. Nothing could change that rubber ball into a canine. Nothing could bestow on it canine nature. Why? It doesn't have the latent potentiality to be a dog. It has the latent potentiality to be gooey, but it doesn't have the latent potentiality to be doggy. So being and non-being aren't the only relevant factors here needed to understand change. There's also a thing's various potentialities. So I'm starting to repeat myself now. The distinction between actuality and potentiality, then, is key to understanding how, contra Parmenides, change is possible. Suppose we think about the ball changing from being solid to being gooey. Well, Parmenides would say, if we say a solid rubber ball can become soft and gooey, well, we're faced with a paradox. Because it can't be the actual gooiness, being, that makes this possible, since the ball isn't yet actually gooey. And it can't be the non-existing gooiness of the ball making this possible, since it doesn't exist, and therefore it can't explain anything. Thus, the ball can never become gooey, and in general, no sort of change is possible, regardless of what our senses tell us. That's what Parmenides would say. But here, Aristotle would reply that while the gooiness itself does not yet exist in the ball in actuality, the gooiness does exist in the ball in potentiality, right now. And this pre-existing potentiality, together with some external influence, heat, let's say, can actualize this latent potentiality and move it from potential to actual. And this suffices to show us how change is possible. Again, heat could move that ball from solid to gooey. Nothing could move that ball from rubber ball to dog. Okay. Now, could it be that all actualizing agents derive their actualizing ability from some other actualizing agent? That is, can every case of moving a thing from potentially X to actual X be brought about by something prior, which itself was moved from potentially Y to actually Y? So let's go back to the ball and adding heat, right? So I'm going to heat up the ball, right? Well, I'm going to have to apply heat. So what do? Oh, I take a stick and I set the stick on fire. So no, the stick wasn't on fire. It was potentially on fire, but not actually on fire. So I had to take a flame. So in order for this stick to actually be heating the ball, it had to be moved from not being on fire to being on fire. And it had to be moved by something else, a flame. Now, where did that flame come from? Did it come from something else, etc.? In other words, the stick acquires its actualizing power from some prior impetus. And then it moves the ball from potentially gooey to actually gooey. But it can only move the ball from potential to actual by borrowing actualizing power from something else. Now, did that borrow its actualizing power from something else? And did that borrow its actualizing power from something else? So is it the case that every mover is moved by some other moved mover? No. Why not? We would end up with what's called an infinite regress. Right? That's the short answer. The long answer, you may want to read Aristotle's unmoved mover argument, or the unmoved mover argument coming from St. Thomas Aquinas. But that's precisely what it's premised on. And this is why Aristotle and Aquinas both thought that you could have philosophical arguments to prove the existence of an unmoved mover or an uncaused cause. And each of those philosophers identified those things, uncaused cause, unmoved mover, with God. And so they thought that these were proofs for the existence of God. Now, a brief aside about possibility and impossibility. Modern philosophy treats possibility and impossibility differently than the ancients and the medievals. For modern philosophers, if something is conceivable without contradiction, as the philosopher David Hume would put it, it is thought to be possible. On this view, a married bachelor is impossible, but an apple tree speaking French is not. And what do I mean by this? What does David Hume mean by this? Well, notice the idea of a married bachelor is not conceivable without contradiction. It's a logical contradiction to speak of a married bachelor, because we know part of the definition of bachelor is unmarried. So you can't have a married, unmarried thing. And therefore, a married bachelor is a contradiction in terms, and it's not conceivable without contradiction, and it's therefore impossible, right? It's impossible there be such a thing as a married bachelor. But for David Hume, could I conceive of a French-speaking apple tree, right? Imagine I'm walking through the apple orchard one day, and I hear, "Bonjour, professeurs, comment ça va?" Right? Good heavens, this apple tree is speaking to me in French. Could I conceive of that? David Hume would say yes. To be honest, I'm not sure he's right, but let's say David Hume would say yes. So an apple tree speaking French is conceivable without contradiction, and therefore it's not impossible to have a French-speaking apple tree. But for Aristotle, for the ancients and for the medievals, apple tree form or nature is a timeless, eternal, immutable essence that does not possess the potentiality to speak French. Thus, a French-speaking apple tree is as impossible, metaphysically impossible, as a married bachelor. So he's not saying it's a logical impossibility, but he is saying it's a metaphysical impossibility. Something can't both be an apple tree and a French speaker at the same time. Why? Because apple tree nature doesn't possess the latent ability to speak French. Now, how we come to know the impossibility of the former may differ from how we come to know the impossibility of the latter, but they are equally impossible. So I can know married bachelor is impossible, and I don't have to observe the world to know that. I simply have to know the meanings of the terms involved. To know that speaking French is not part of apple tree nature, I can't know that just by thinking about the words. I actually have to go out and observe the world, or at least that's what Aristotle would say. It's my commerce with the world, it's my observations of apple trees that allows me to come to know apple tree nature. And then once I do have experience in the world and I observe apple trees and I gain an understanding of apple tree nature, then, says Aristotle, I know that apple tree nature precludes speaking French. So I think it's in the notes. Look at it if you like, but I'm not going to take time. Okay, so the nature of being, what a being is, right? So what a thing is often referred to as its whatness or its quiddity. So notice there are several senses in which a thing can be said to be. That is, there are several correct answers to the question, what is that? Right? So if someone were to see me walking down the hall and point and say, what is that? Another person might respond, oh, that is a human being. And he or she would have answered correctly, right? They would have correctly answered the question, what is that? But that wouldn't be the only correct answer someone could offer, since that's not the only way that I be. That's not the only thing that I am. One might also correctly respond, that is an FIU professor. Or, less kindly, that is an overweight middle-aged consumer. All of those would be true things. That is a human being. That is a FIU professor. That is an overweight middle-aged consumer. So notice I am human. I am, well, actually I'm not 190 pounds now. I've lost some weight, okay. But I was at the time I wrote this slide, 190 pounds. And I am an FIU faculty member, philosophy professor, right? Again, I'm not standing in the room before you. I'm dictating this video lecture, but you get the idea. But the above ways that I be are importantly different. Some of them are more central to what I am, and some of them are more peripheral. So this brings us to an important distinction. Aristotle, and for that matter, Plato, makes the same distinction between essential characteristics and accidental characteristics. An essential characteristic, or a set of essential properties, is that which makes an individual the kind of thing that it is. That is its essence, its whatness, its quiddity. It's coming from the Latin word quid for what, right? It's quiddity, its whatness. It explains why that thing behaves and develops and changes and moves the way that it does. It defines the things that potentials, ways it could be. It also explains why it doesn't behave, develop in certain ways. Right? This has to do with formal and final causality, which I'll have more to say about later. But the formal and final causes of a thing determine its actual and potential properties. So again, my whatness, my essence, in this case, my human nature, alerts you to the fact that I have the ability to speak French, perhaps not in actuality, but in potentiality. But it also alerts you to the fact that I do not have the ability to breathe underwater. Why? It's not in human nature. It's not something that human beings can do. Right? So my essence determines ways I can move, can change, can develop, can do, and ways I can't move, change, develop, things I can't do. Likewise with the essence of an apple tree, or the essence of anything, cats, and kittens, and dogs, and puppies, etc. Accidental properties are those properties of a thing which are not essential. An individual could gain or lose those properties and still remain the same unique individual. So if I were to gain a wart, I would still be the same individual. And if I was to lose a wart, then I would be the same individual. That would be an accidental property. Think of Socrates. Socrates was essentially a human being. He happens to have been the husband of Xantippe, but that's an accidental feature. Even if he became a widow and Xantippe passed away, he'd still be Socrates, right? Or if he had married someone else, he'd still be Socrates. His essential nature is human being. Accidental properties might be being snub-nosed, or the husband of a Xantippe, or Athenian. By contrast, the essence of a thing cannot change, or it will no longer be the same unique thing. So Aristotle would say that I am essentially a human, but I'm only accidentally a 190-pound philosophy professor. I could lose weight, undergo a quantitative change, Or I could get another job, undergo a qualitative change, or I could go to Starbucks for coffee, undergo a change in location, but I would still be me. I'd still be the same unique individual that I am. So Aristotle thought there are four kinds of changes: quantitative change, qualitative change, change in location, and the fourth one I haven't mentioned yet, which would be substantial change. But we'll see in a moment, a substantial change is importantly different from the first three. So I would still be me in that I would still have the same essential nature, quiddity, along with its latent potentialities. For instance, the ability to speak French. I can survive a quantitative change. I can survive a qualitative change. I can survive a change in location. In fact, I would very much like to undergo certain quantitative changes. Truth be known, I actually would like to lose a little more weight. But when I die, I undergo a substantial change because I am no longer a human being. More precisely, I am no more. How sad. In my place is a new substance, and that substance is a human corpse. And human corpses have potentialities that living human bodies do not have. For instance, human corpses have the ability to decompose. Living human beings do not have the ability to decompose. Right? Substantial change is the passing away of an old substance and the creation of a new substance. This happens when matter is given a new essential form. Forms themselves, however, never change. Human nature is human nature is human nature, Aristotle thought. Maybe he was wrong about that, but that's what he thought, right? And matter doesn't change. However, the way form and matter combine do change. And when matter takes on alternative, different substantial form, it's a new substance, right? So when my living body loses its life principle and is no longer a human being and now becomes a human corpse, that's a substantial change. I, as a unique individual, no longer exist. Other examples of substantial change might be this: were I to take a sphere and cut it in half, the sphere no longer exists, and instead two hemispheres exist. Notice a sphere possesses the potentiality to roll around and off a table. Hemispheres do not possess the abilities to roll around. They can wobble, but they can't roll. Or if I were to take water and oxygen, if I were to separate water into oxygen and hydrogen, the water, along with the water nature, the water form, the water essence, no longer exists. Notice water has a nature. Water is such as to freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It is such as to boil at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. But if I were to take the water and separate it into oxygen and hydrogen, I have two very different substances. Neither oxygen nor hydrogen have the ability to freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or the ability to boil at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Both of them are flammable in a way that water is not. So you have very different substances now. Again, it's a substantial change because the one essence has been replaced with two other essences. Any existing thing has properties, some of which are accidental and others of which are essential. Essences or forms demarcate what the substance's essential properties are. That is to say, a thing's form causes the thing to be a certain, let's try that again. That is to say, the essence is what causes the thing to be the thing that it is and determine why it is the way that it is and why it develops and moves and changes as it does. Again, its potential and actual properties. Oops. I should have another bullet here. The essence also determines why it doesn't change and develop in ways that it can't, right? So it is cat nature that is what causes the cat to meow as opposed to bark, right? It is dog nature which causes the dog to bark as opposed to meow, etc. Now, Another way of answering the question, what is that, is to not talk about the whatness of a thing, but the how of a thing, how it exists. In other words, to name a quality or a quantity or a mode of its existence. So you're not referencing its essence, you're referencing, again, a quality, perhaps an accidental quality. So a quality or quantity of a thing, being good or bad, red, tall, many. So you might see a certain red bird landing on a tree branch, point to it and ask, what is that? Were someone to say that is a cardinal, he or she would have answered correctly. But that's not the only correct answer that you could give to the question, what is that? A person might truly reply, that is red. Say, oh, that's red. Now, redness does exist, to be sure. But notice something, redness can't exist on its own. Redness can only exist as a property of something else. Redness exists only as a property of other things, which can exist on their own. So there's only redness because there are red things. There are red cardinals and red stop signs and red fire engines and red apples. And because there are red things, there are redness. But if you got rid of all the red things, you would have effectively eliminated redness, Aristotle would say. So redness is not the quiddity of a thing, it's not the whatness of a thing, it's the merely how a thing happens to be. In this case, an accidental property of the cardinal. So now it's important to distinguish what Aristotle wants to distinguish between what he calls primary substances and secondary substances. Primary substances are those things that can kind of exist on their own. For instance, cardinals. They are ontologically independent. Secondary substances are real things, but they're things that can only exist as properties of other things. They cannot exist on their own. They only can exist as properties of primary substances. Redness would be an example. Catness would be another example. So this is what leads Aristotle to say that cat form, catness, cat nature, only exists because they're individual cats. Cat form is not a primary substance, according to Aristotle. Cats are primary substances. Cat form is a secondary substance, like redness, etc. So elsewhere, I don't know if I have this in the notes here, but elsewhere he says, a primary substance is anything that can be the subject of predication. So notice if I say, that cardinal is red, you have cardinal is red, I'm predicating redness as a property of the cardinal. So anything that goes into that box of subject is a primary substance, but things that go into that box as predicate adjective would be secondary substances. My car is yellow, yellow is a secondary substance. Right? He is a human being, secondary substance. Aristotle would say that redness, well, I'm repeating myself now, is a secondary substance, while the actual particular cardinal is the primary substance. Further, while being a cardinal is essential to the primary substance nature, being red is accidental. For instance, we could spray paint that cardinal blue, not that I ever would, and it would still be a cardinal, it would still be that unique primary substance. Being human is essential to my nature, but being 190 pounds is accidental. Let's hope, well, actually, I have evidence now. It is, I'm still me. Primary substances are individual existing objects with inherent essential natures, individual human beings, individual cardinals, individual lumps of gold, etc. Note again the difference between Plato and Aristotle here. For Plato, the more abstract realities were more real. But for Aristotle, it's the reverse. Particular things are more real than their secondary abstractions. So a primary substance is an existing thing, and it's always a combination of form and matter, right? It's matter that is taking on some essential form. For Aristotle, form does not and cannot exist apart from matter, though it is separable in thought. We can imagine, for instance, Michelangelo's David for instance, apart from the actual marble which constitute it. So imagine the form of Michelangelo's David, but instead of being in marble, we could imagine that same form in glass, or in terracotta, or in bronze, or in cheese, let's say, right? It's the same form, but different matter. So we can separate form and matter in thought. We can just contemplate the form, if you've ever had art appreciation class, you might be contemplating the form of the statue, its negative and positive space, right? Independent of the stuff of which that statue is made. So we can consider form independent of matter. We can consider matter independent of form. I can think of gold generically, or water generically, etc. But any actual existing bit of gold is going to have a particular form, and any particular existing form is going to be informing some actual bit of matter. So while these are separable in thought, they're not separable in reality. There are always two sides to a single coin. Secondary substances are those objects or properties constituted by particular individual primary substances. We've talked about that already, right? So do there exist philosophy teachers? Yes, but only because there exist human beings. Do there exist blondes? Yes, but likewise the same thing. Do wedding rings exist? Yes, but only as instantiating, being instantiated by particulars. The change of a primary substance is a substantial change. It'd probably be better for me to read that. A substantial change is a change of a primary substance. And it destroys the primary substance in question and replaces it with a new primary substance. Again, water with hydrogen and oxygen. And now we've come to the doctrine of four causes. And I think this is where I'm going to pause and conclude this lecture. And I'll take up this concept and the remaining notes in the subsequent lecture, okay? So hopefully this has been helpful and clear to you. That's the plan. Of course, you're invited to contact me, ask me questions about anything that is not clear. And for all I know, I've misspoken and maybe I've said something that is just wrong. So if you find an inconsistency in something I've said with either the notes or something else, bring it to my attention and I can clarify or correct, okay? Again, thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.